Hi, I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek. In this series of videos, I'm going to address Hank Hanegraaff's book, Christianity in Crisis. The original version came out in 1993, and the 21st Century edition was published in 2009. I thought it might be good to include the updated version to see if Mr. Hanegraaff had retracted any of the things he said 16 years earlier. Now, I'm not going to address every point made in the book for the sake of brevity, but I will try to address the main issues that I feel demand a response. Before I discuss the book, though, I'd like to take a look at its author to provide you with some context. You see, many people will read a book like this and say, "Wow, I had no idea how horrible the Word of Faith movement is. I didn't know they believe all of these things." But when I read it, I say, this is the sloppiest apologetics book I've ever read in my life. It's full of ad hominem attacks, guilt by association tactics, misinformation, straw man arguments, and basically every logical fallacy you can employ in argumentation. Now, why am I able to see what others don't? Well, it's very simple. I know the subject matter. I've been around the Word of Faith movement for over 35 years. I've attended the premier Word of Faith Bible School, Kenneth Hagin's Rhema Bible Training Center, for 2 years. I've read Kenneth Hagin's books. I've attended his seminars and camp meetings. I've listened to his audios. I've watched his videos to the point that I'm confident that I know what he taught and believed, and what he didn't teach and what he didn't believe. I've read and listened to a lot of apologetics material over the years, everything from C.S. Lewis to Charles Ryrie to the Banana Man. Now, if you don't know who the Banana Man is, he's a guy who tried to make the case for creationism by holding up a banana and announcing that it was designed by God to fit the human hand. Apparently, he didn't realize that the modern banana was cultivated over the centuries in order to appear in its current form. Now, that's what we call bad apologetics. But honestly, it's no worse than Christianity in Crisis. With so little understanding of or respect for proper apologetics, it's no wonder Hank Hanegraaff encountered so much opposition from within the Christian Research Institute. Having seen through Mr. Hanegraaff's atrocious distortions and detected the venom in his wording, I had to ask, what's the deal with this guy? Why would he stoop to this level? It was pretty obvious to me that this was more than just simple apologetics for the sake of defending the Christian faith. This was clearly done in a fashion that would prove controversial and provocative. But by creating controversy, it was bound to sell lots of copies, and it certainly did. Hank Hanegraaff was reportedly paid $500,000 in royalties as of 1994 for a book that was mostly researched and partly written by Christian Research Institute staff members. As the host of the very popular Bible Answer Man radio broadcast, he had a great marketing platform, and he could promote the book to his heart's content. And that's exactly what he did, along with a couple dozen other books, presumably written in the same fashion as Christianity in Crisis. With so many copies of this book in print, and with all of the documentation in the book, hundreds of thousands of people have been led to believe that this book is the definitive work on the matter, and the case against the Word of Faith movement has been closed. Now, I'll get to the content of the book in the next video, but for now, let me ask you this. What if Mr. Hanegraaff isn't what he appears? What if, in fact, the public's perception of the man isn't consistent with the facts? Would that cause you to take a second look at the claims of the book? Let's begin with Hank Hanegraaff's education. Unlike his predecessor at the Christian Research Institute, the late Dr. Walter Martin, Hank Hanegraaff has no degree in theology. He has no formal training in apologetics, philosophy, or theology from a university. Now, I'm not saying that you can't be a good apologist or have a good grasp of theology without a degree. I don't have a seminary education either, and I do philosophy and theology and apologetics all the time. But then I don't run the Christian Research Institute, and I don't host the Bible Answer Man radio broadcast. You see, prior to his assuming control of the Christian Research Institute, every host of the Bible Answer Man program had such an education. Many people filled in for Dr. Martin from time to time when he was away from the studio, but they were all well versed in the subject matter that he discussed on a regular basis. Mr. Hanegraaff wasn't. As we'll hear in this clip, that's one reason many people who knew Dr. Martin and were familiar with his operation were convinced that he would never have chosen Hank Hanegraaff to run the organization and host the broadcast in the event that he was out of the picture.
I remember getting a newsletter from CRI in 89 or late 89, early 90 that had a little blurb in the middle of it talking about a guy named Hank Hanegraaff who was going to take the ministry forward into the future. And at that time, I had never heard of him. I mean, I know a lot of people in the cult and apologetics world because I'm in this field myself, and I had honestly never heard of Hank Hanegraaff. And I just assumed he was some kind of some seminarian that Walter Martin was impressed with and kind of came out of nowhere. I knew nothing about him at that point.
Okay, you thought he was a seminarian, which is what most people would have thought. But in fact, your book says that he was really just some kind of a bean counter there at CRI.
Yeah, if you, I got a hold of his resume for the book, and the book talks about different ministries that he supposedly worked for. He helped raise money for them and this kind of thing. There is no mention in his bio that CRI had that said anything about him being any kind of a theologian, having any seminary or Bible college training in the field of cults and philosophy and apologetics. There is nothing like that in his biographical statement.
The man telling the story in that clip is Jay Howard, the author of the book Hard Questions for the Bible Answer Man. He had met Dr. Martin as a student in his weekly Bible classes, and after his passing, he interviewed his widow, Darlene, several times, and was very familiar with the Christian Research Institute and its history, having done a decade of research. So how did Hanegraaff become the president of the Christian Research Institute? Well, to answer that, we have to go back a bit further. You see, Dr. Martin was a brilliant theologian and apologist, but he wasn't a great businessman and fundraiser. And apparently, those are Hank Hanegraaff's strong points. Jay Howard continues.
So what was he doing at CRI? Was he, I think you said in the book that he was a fundraiser, and that's why Walter Martin brought him onto the board.
Yeah, see, Walter Martin would go to a church called Mount Perrin, Church of God in Atlanta, Georgia, where the pastor really liked him, about once a year. And at that time, Hank Hanegraaff was attending Mount Perrin in Atlanta, and that's when he first met Walter Martin. He started talking to him and kind of promoting himself to Walter Martin. And so they met a couple of years before he got involved at CRI, back in the 80s.
Okay, so he met Hank Hanegraaff in Atlanta, and then that's where he decided to bring him on board as a fundraiser. So Hank Hanegraaff ended up getting onto the board, and I read in the book that the board comprised all of 3 people aside from Walter Martin. That's rather unusual.
Yeah, from what I could see, for several years, Martin kept a very lean board, usually 4 or 5 people, hardly ever more than 5. And at the time of his death in June of 89, there was only 3 other men on the board besides himself, and Hank Hanegraaff had been one of those men.
Well-known Christian apologist Jacob Prasch agrees with the assessment that Hank Hanegraaff should never have been the president of the Christian Research Institute.
Unfortunately, something happened with Dr. Martin. Well, he was very gifted and very noble of intent himself. He surrounded himself with people who were not always of noble character. Some of them were rather nefarious, one of which was Hank Hanegraaff, and Hank Hanegraaff was not the only one who was problematic. Robert Morey is another one. He surrounded himself with people where there are major ethical issues. When I met Hank, I was not impressed. He had written a book I agreed with uh, concerning refuting the money preachers. After Dave Hunt wrote The Seduction of Christianity, his book was the follow-up classic, and it was a good book. But the outline and concept of that book existed before him. It came from other people who had been previously associated with Dr. Walter Martin's ministry, including Jackie and Professor Bill Elnor, who's now with the Lord. Dr. Bill Elnor, who's now with the Lord. Let's go forward and look at this. Something happened with that ministry that Hank got control of it. He has done things that Dr. Walter Martin certainly never would have approved of, that Dr. Walter Martin's family says Dr. Martin would not approve of, and that decent people who were associated with that ministry, such as Dr. Ron Rhodes, did not approve of and left. Over 30 people left in protest, largely on ethical grounds, after Hank Hanegraaff somehow managed to get control of that once fine organization. It's the organization responsible for Dr. Martin's books, Kingdom of the Cult, its second edition, and also his posthumous book, which I had the honor of cover endorsing, Kingdom of the Occult. Hank never should have gotten control of that ministry, but he did.
Now let me note that none of these gentlemen are Word of Faith proponents. To the contrary, they're also opposed to the Word of Faith movement and its theology, as are numerous others who have sought to have Hanegraaff removed as the president of the Christian Research Institute. And these aren't the only well-known apologists who have questioned Hanegraaff's ethics. The late Dr. D. James Kennedy also had issues with the Answer Man.
Was there any particular reason that you know of why he left Fort Lauderdale area and the Coral Ridge Ministries there?
He was working for EE, and when Parrish, who was then our vice president, went to Atlanta to start his own ministry, he went with him to work for him.
Okay, so there was no problem with him that you know of?
No. As far as any personal problem, not that I knew of. He later was removed from that ministry because of the conduct that he exhibited there. I just talked to Archie Parrish at General Assembly a couple of days ago, and he was telling me about the very unhappy circumstances where he was forced to let him go.
Now, maybe you can just speak to this just for a moment. Was Hank Hanegraaff a representative for Evangelism Explosion in Atlanta, or just when he was with you?
Just when he was with us, he would then represent us to donors anywhere in the country, not just Atlanta. But when he left us and went to Atlanta, he no longer was.
Okay, so there was no reason to. So he didn't leave the EE program in Atlanta. He actually left that in Fort Lauderdale.
That's correct.
Okay.
Best I remember. That's been, 20 years or more ago.
Sure. And now, when did you first hear about Hank Hanegraaff's personal witnessing training program?
The first time I ever heard of that is when I began to get letters from people telling me that that Hanegraaff had plagiarized my book, Evangelism Explosion, which is the basis of the whole evangelistic EE Evangelism Explosion ministry all over the world, and that he had come up with a very, very similar program, and I guess that's what he called it. And it was till people began to send me a page of his book and a page of my book right next to it, another page of his and a page of mine, and on, that I had ever seen it or even heard of it. And they were wanting me. I had all kinds of people saying, you really ought to sue this man for plagiarism. And I said then what I have always said, I don't think that's what Christians ought to do. I don't think we're supposed to sue other Christians. And I met him one time at a hotel somewhere, I don't remember when or where, and he was trying to explain to me how this wasn't really plagiarism. And I said to him, Hank, look, forget it, don't worry about it. I have no intention of suing you. I don't believe Christians ought to sue other Christians. So just forget about it. And so that was my experience with that.
Christian Research Institute and Hank Hanegraaff claims that you gave Mr. Hanegraaff permission to use evangelism explosion materials for the development of the personal witnessing training program, either verbal or written authorization. Did you ever do this?
No, that is just not the case. In fact, the matter is, I did, at his request, take it to the board and ask them if they wanted to get involved with doing something like this, and they turned it down. And if I had given him permission, then I would ask at that hotel that time, why would he have so belabored the point that this really wasn't plagiarism? Now, I think I had seen the pages set side by side. I never even made an investigation on my own to get a hold of it or anything, but since people had sent me the copy of the pages, and since there was such a startling comparison between the two, why was he trying so hard to convince me that this wasn't plagiarism when he could have said to me, well, Jim, this is what I've come up with, and since you gave me permission to use your book any way I wanted, I guess you'll recognize the large segments of this coming from your book. He never said that. Mm-hmm. He kept saying it wasn't plagiarism. Now, apparently, he's saying it was, but he had permission from me.
So, against all odds, Hank Hanegraaff managed to make his way onto the board at the Christian Research Institute, and then when Dr. Martin passed away suddenly at the age of 60, he took the helm. How did that play out? Jay Howard fills us in.
Jay, the book gives a rather scandalous description of some of the shenanigans that went on at Walter Martin's funeral. Why don't you sketch that funeral for us and let us know what happened there?
Okay. Well, the family and the board members were in a room. If you've been part of a funeral before, there's always a room where the people involved in the funeral, the relatives, that kind of thing, they sit in this room until they're called to go to sit in the front of the church. And so Walter Martin's immediate family, his board, John Ankerberg, Hank Hanegraaff, they were in this room together. It was a handful of people, literally. And a few minutes before they were to be ushered into the church, Hank Hanegraaff approached Darlene Martin, who was Walter Martin's widow, and asked to see her funeral notes. So she was in a state of shock, and she wasn't going to doubt the guy because she trusted him. So she handed his notes to Hank Hanegraaff, and Hanegraaff took them to another man that she remembers handing the notes to this other man, and he wrote something on the paper on the bottom of her funeral notes. And so he came back a couple minutes later and said, read this note once you finish reading your prepared typed out speech. And so she just tucked it in there at the bottom and took it with her. And when she got to her prepared statement, typed out statement, she read that about her husband and his ministry. And then I listened to the audio tapes of the funeral, and right when she hits this prepared statement that he had written down, I mean, not that he had written down, but somebody else had written for her in cursive writing, she started to stammer a little bit because she was trying to read it for the first time in her life. And the note that, and I have this note because she sent me a photocopy of this handwritten note that was at the bottom of her statement.
It's also reproduced in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book, and in that she started talking about how her and Walter had talked many times about who would take over CRI once he died or retired, and then she launched into this, and that man is Hank Hanegraaff, and we thank God for Hank Hanegraaff, and Hank Hanegraaff is a great guy, and he's going to do this, he's going to do that, and so it was really kind of a mini commercial for Hank Hanegraaff that she had not even prepared. It was Hanegraaff's own statement that he literally wanted read into the funeral notes, into the recordings and the videotaping of the funeral, so that it would appear that she was giving her imprimatur, her pledge of loyalty to Hank, that he was the man that Walter Martin had chosen. Now, I interviewed Darlene Martin several times over the course of putting this book together, and she told me something very interesting, that when Walter Martin would come home at night, from CRI, he wanted to be just father and a husband. She said that he never would talk about what's going on in the ministry, who we're hiring, who we're firing, nothing about the stuff they're going to be doing. And so she didn't know anything about Hanegraaff. There was no talking, in bed, hanging around with Walter Martin, in the wee hours of the morning, talking about what would happen if he died. That was all made up.
So according to Mr. Howard, Hanegraaff plotted and maneuvered his way into the leadership role. But there was one more move to make for him to consolidate his power. He had to be the man at the microphone for the Bible Answer Man broadcast. How did he make that happen? Let's listen.
Jay, tell me about Craig and Lisa Hawkins.
Well, Lisa, I think she worked in the, she was a secretary there, I believe, but Craig was one of the senior researchers. In fact, many times when Walter Martin was out of town for a weekend or something, or for a couple of days, he had Craig fill in as the voice of the Bible Answer Man for a day or two. And Craig's another one of those people I have met in the past. I don't really hang out with him too much anymore. He lives in Santa Ana, California, I believe. But he's a very gifted speaker. He has a background in philosophy and cults and world religions. And so, he was really good at getting behind a microphone and taking calls and questions because he had such a broad knowledge of the Bible and philosophy and Christian apologetics, something that Walter Martin had. And so Craig Hawkins spent many, many days being the voice of the Bible Answer Man when Walter Martin died after. And, there was like Ken Samples, Rob Bowman, Paul Carden. There was about a half dozen men that filled in, but Craig did it a lot. And to be the president of CRI, you'd have to be the voice of the Bible Answer Man. I mean, it's, you couldn't be the president of CRI and not be the voice of the Bible Answer Man program. So Hanegraaff understood that he had to do something to get rid of Craig Hawkins. In fact, he told people before the firings and after the firings that his wife Kathy had a dream or something, and God had told her that Craig Hawkins he was like demon possessed.
Have thou nothing to do with that righteous man, in other words.
Yeah, and so they fired Craig Hawkins, or I should say they forced him out, made it terribly uncomfortable for him to be there, because Hanegraaff, again, he needed to be the Bible Answer Man voice, and Craig Hawkins was probably the one man who could stand between him and that chair. So he got rid of Craig Hawkins. He feared Craig Hawkins in a sense, because most of these men, I think he was living in fear that they would figure out how bad he was, how limited background he had in cults and philosophy and the Bible and everything else. And so he little by little got rid of pretty much everybody who had a real background in these kinds of things, who had studied them, gone to college for these issues. And so little by little, most of the men were sort of moved out of the CRI or outright fired. And Craig Hawkins was one of those.
So for the past 28 years, Hank Hanegraaff has been the president of the Christian Research Institute and the host of the Bible Answer Man broadcast. Despite all of the controversy and opposition, he has managed to survive in those roles until now. None of his prior shenanigans really had any doctrinal implications. They were all about his qualifications, his ethics, and his management style. But in April of 2017, Hanegraaff made a move that could prove to be his undoing when he joined a Greek Orthodox church in Charlotte, North Carolina. You see, the Greek Orthodox Church is a part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and as such, it has a problematic theology for somebody who is known as the Bible Answer Man. Among them are the veneration of Mary, prayers to dead saints, and the rejection of sola scriptura, the belief that the scriptures alone are our authority in spiritual matters, not scripture and church tradition, and sola fide, salvation by faith alone. Let's listen to Dr. James White discussing this.
How could someone who is in Eastern Orthodoxy take the position of being the Bible Answer Man? I thought the Bible Answer Man, that very title, that position I mean, it's not a position. It's not like it's a biblical position or something. Someone doesn't get elected to be Bible answer man. But the presupposition of it is that the Bible is the final source of the answers for the questions that you're going to have about the Christian faith. But in Eastern Orthodoxy, that's not the case. You can go on YouTube right now. Go on YouTube, put in Eastern Orthodoxy Sola Scriptura. Start paging down. Page after page after page of videos by Eastern Orthodox individuals who are rejecting the concept of Sola Scriptura and saying, no, that's never been what the apostles taught. You have to have apostolic teaching. You have to have the tradition. The scriptures are a part of that tradition. You cannot interpret that scripture outside of that tradition. So how is it possible to be the Bible answer man when the worldview and religious commitments that you have embraced would forbid you from doing so? And can Mr. Hanegraaff actually try to pretend that nothing has changed? He will actually make the statement that my beliefs have been codified in 20 different books. Nothing has changed. Oh, yes, something has changed. It is very, very difficult for anyone, I think, to take seriously the assertion found on CRI's webpage. If you go to the webpage for, I think it was the second day, the 11th, in the description, there you have that very statement. Hank's beliefs have been codified in 20 different books and nothing has changed. And it's like, yes. I mean, can you imagine if I converted to Roman Catholicism and said, well, hey, my views have been codified in 24 books. Nothing's changed. Of course something has changed. The very matrix, the very milieu, the very context of everything that I've written was totally different than what I would now be saying was true. So didn't everyone who bought Hank's books, weren't they assuming the background of Sola Scriptura in his own thought? And if Sola Scriptura can no longer be affirmed, how can that be understood as not being a change?
So you can see from these testimonies from people who have been in a position to know that Hank Hanegraaff had no formal theological education, which should have prevented him from becoming the president of the Christian Research Institute, has a history of ethical problems, encountered a lot of resistance to his leadership upon taking over at the Christian Research Institute based on his lack of qualifications and ethics, managed to remove the biggest obstacle to his leadership at the Christian Research Institute so that he could host the Bible Answer Man broadcast, has run the Christian Research Institute in a way that Dr. Martin would never have condoned, and has now apparently abandoned the position that the Bible is the ultimate authority for Christians. Now, I'm not Hank Hanegraaff's judge, and I take no pleasure in compiling this information. I prefer to stick with discussing doctrinal issues as a rule, but in order for people to understand how Christianity in crisis came about, I think you have to have some frame of reference regarding the man behind the book. With this track record established, let's proceed in the next video to examine the contents of Christianity in Crisis.